Hello and welcome back to It's Not Just Black and White, where the topics that we discuss are most likely going to be controversial. So if you're easily offended or even very difficultly offended, this may not be the place for you. As always, my name is Ali Laik and I'm sitting here with Corey Bearclaw
Yo.
and Jordan Brown.
What up?
Gentlemen, thank you for coming together today. This week might be one of our more exciting topics, and this week we'll be getting into the Olympics. I know that we're all really excited to talk about these things. I know that we have a lot to say, but we'll start basically with ancient Greek history. Then we'll move on to Olympics, political or not. Then we'll go to modern day history of the Olympics. Then we'll go to current events, because this year's Olympics certainly had a lot of controversy around them, and we want to make sure that we talk about it. So without further ado, let's get it started. So let's start in ancient Greek. Let's go back all the way over there. You guys know that this is kind of my thing. I always go back history as far back as I can. There's always a BC and an AD in my dates.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
All the way back to the beginning.
All the way back.
It's important.
Yeah, so the ancient Greek Olympics, they're a little bit different from what we might see modern day, but they are just like the modern day ones are an adaptation or evolution of what the Olympics would look like today. The main thing is that before it was Greek city-states that competed, and now the entire world competes on the world stage. So the first ancient Greek Olympics, they took place from 776 BC to around 793, 794 AD, depending on who you ask. And it's basically an ancient tradition where the strongest people from all over the Greek world came to compete for the title of champion, and that champion will break down what exactly happens in terms of rewards, but that champion became immortalized through stories and statues on the same level as gods. It originally took place in a sanctuary of Zeus in Olympia, in a region of Elis, which is modern day, I believe, Ilia.
Yeah, and I think legend has it that it was like Hercules himself who built this grand Colosseum to honor his father to have these games.
You know, one thing I have to question about that whole myth and stuff like that. So obviously there's people who built this. So where are the people who actually built it, saying, yo, no, but he didn't build this. We literally built this. We have the blueprints right here.
Well, with Greece itself, they say that Hercules was actually a man, right? And when I went to Bulgaria, I went through this museum, and I know this is a little off track, but I think it's relevant.
Yeah.
But so I went to Bulgaria, I went to a museum, right? And Bulgaria actually has a deep, rich history. And I found these carvings and stuff, and basically these people, they were the ancient Thessalonians.
Okay.
These are a biblical group, right? Yeah. But these Thessalonians, they were writing about this guy Hercules in Greece. So you think as far back as that was, they were still talking about this man, and I'm sure there was people who built it, but maybe when he was alive as a man, he had a hand in building this Colosseum.
In ancient Greece, they also have stories of demigods, right? A demigod is basically half god and half human. So Hercules, and there were many demigods. The one with the ankle, who's that guy?
Oh, Achilles.
So Achilles was the son of Athena, and the story goes that he was this kid that was born, and she dipped him in some sparkling water or whatever, some holy waters, and she dipped him and she held him by his ankle when he was a baby. And that's why he had the weakness in the Achilles heel.
And that's what ultimately killed him.
Yeah, so back to Hercules. Hercules was the son of Zeus. Zeus basically came down and, had relations with some woman who was a human, and then Hercules was born.
Yes, but
So-
I mean, it still ties back to the question that where are the people who actually built the Colosseum that said no, Hercules didn't do this all himself. Yeah. This was a whole group event. This wasn't just me.
I'm sure it was implied that he didn't do it himself, right? But I think
he's just a great big architect.
Yeah,
That's the legend,
and you have to think the people who built it were probably peasants, and they can't really say anything, right? It's
And
not
they believe their faith is going to be different,
Yeah.
And still, let's say there was a contractor, I highly doubt, or there's most likely a mason, okay, a mason that built with the stones and whatnot. And there's a lot of these architects in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, that are famous, that built all these aqueducts and things that, they say that Romans built things we can't have or whatever. So I'm sure wherever these blueprints are, they might be around, but
There's no way they're around.
I mean, dude,
100%.
it's going to be real
The
difficult.
tablets have disintegrated. By
It's
now.
going to be real difficult. And if it was papyrus, so maybe in the Library of Alexandria, when that got burned, maybe we lost some stuff. We lost, like they
We
said,
lost a
We
lot.
didn't
Wow.
lose just some. We lost pretty much everything.
Everything.
So they could have easily been lost in there, innit?
Yeah.
You know
But that's for another episode that
Yeah.
we could definitely talk about the burning of Alexandria.
Clearly, we're huge fans of ancient history.
Yeah.
But without getting sidetracked, the Olympia is like a city, and it's also where the sanctuary of Zeus is. It's also where the Olympic Games in ancient Greece took place, and it was named after Mount Olympus, which, as we know, was the highest point of the ancient Greek Empire, and also considered where Zeus and his family and the other gods lived. And to compete in the Olympia at that time was the same or akin to competing amongst gods, and in fact you were immortalized if you were champion. It was mostly men, and I say mostly men because there's a distinction that we'll get into later. It was mostly men, but the strongest men from different regions of the Greek world. Thousands of people also came to watch, so they all came and gathered to the city. Now, there is some historical dispute between the religious origins of the games. So there's two main arguments. One is that it's a festival for Zeus, named after, obviously where they lived. That's why they said that it's named after it. And a lot of sacrifices were made specifically to Zeus. And also the second one is there were funeral games held in honor of deceased local heroes, because there was lots of rituals, specifically lots of funeral rituals and rites, and a lot of sacrifices were made. They sacrificed a lot of oxen, and parts of those oxen were completely burned and incinerated as the sacrifice, and then the rest were eaten by the people that were there attending the different events. And also it became kind of like a pilgrimage. Every time there was an Olympics or an Olympia, like the hordes of people would go. Merchants would be allowed to go there because it's safe. Musicians, artists, some poor people would just go there just to be able to eat. And it became kind of this almost a religious thing, because it's a sporting event, but it was very based around like their religion and like paganism and whatnot. So the original games, they had some that were similar to ours, or like adaptations of what we have now, or some were very different, right? The first 12 games in ancient Greece, they were only a foot race, 190-meter foot race. It was one race, one event. You come, and it was only one day. You'd come, you do the race, you'd leave. And that was kind of when it began, and it was more so like a local hero thing than like a nationalism type thing, because it does, even in Greece, in ancient Greece, develop into this nationalist pride type of situation where even emperors competed,
And I mean, when you think back to like when we were developing as kids and stuff like that, we think like the original race and original challenge between our friends is who's the fastest.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, hey, I'll race you. Let's play tag because I want to. That's a way of developing who's the
In our
fastest and
nature,
stuff
yeah,
like
good
that. So
point.
it's like in our nature to see and compete with each other, and like that's the basic, most fundamental way to challenge each other and
Great
know
point.
who's the fastest. So maybe that's why the Olympics started, because hey, we want to know who's the fastest person.
I'll
It's
beat you in a race,
yeah,
buddy.
because it
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
necessarily like weightlifting back then. Like it wasn't like people are going to gyms in the same way that we are today, or even
So,
in like 1,000 years
As
afterwards.
a whole of society in ancient Greece, not everybody's lifting. Like whoever could afford it would just wine and party, and whoever can't would work in a farm, because
Exactly.
agriculture was like the biggest thing. In fact, the Olympics were held in the summer, because that's also the slowest period, for farming, and that's why more people could eventually come as well. And they would have it at the hottest time of the summer, because that's when the crops don't really matter, right? You know what I mean? That's why it's Summer Olympics, and that's why eventually there was the adaptation of the Winter Olympics, which came about in modern times, not even in ancient times. So some of the events that were introduced later on are the pentathlon, which was added in about 708 BC. It's running, jumping, and discus throw. So their running was a little bit different. They had a thing called the stade, which is the first level of the foot race, because they had 3 levels, which is a 200-meter foot race. Then they have the Diaulos. Okay, the Diaulos is 400-meter foot race, it's double the stade. Then there's the Dolikos. The Dolikos is 7 to 24 stades. So their races got pretty big. You know, they imagine like a...
Well, we have the same ones, you know. We still have like the 200 meter. We still have the 100 meter. We still got the 400 meter.
Yeah.
We have the 800 meter. And you have
There you go.
I think also the
1500 meter.
1600.
1600.
Yeah.
There you go. That's
Yeah.
exactly what this is,
Yep.
right? That's exact. But this says if that's 1600, 7 to 24. Yeah, that's about six stades. You know, that's pretty cool. So they have that, and that stadium basically more or less looks like a today's football stadium or any coliseum that we built today. So there's that influence again. Then there's jumping. So this is like a long jump type situation. They held these either stone or lead weights. They were called halteres, and they would run, and right before they jumped, they would like push the stones back or drop them back to give them more leap, and they would leap higher. And these are not just strong men; these are like the strongest men. Okay, they're all fit. They're all built like gods, and thus they believe that these guys can compete to a level to then become immortalized as gods. Discus throw, which is a stone that eventually became iron, lead, or bronze. It's basically the same thing that we do today, discus. Wrestling, which a lot of these exercises that they did were like military exercises. So the wrestling was like a military type thing because they had strong militaries and the city-states were always warring. The most famous being Spartans, Sparta and Athens, right? That would be the most memorable one because they were always warring. But all these guys are warring. Then they had boxing. This was shocking to me. Like, it's not modern day boxing, but it's boxing. Like,
You're throwing blows.
They had raps called himantes, which is like the raps that go underneath our modern day boxing gloves. They should just have those, and then they fought like that, boxed. And then later they had leather straps. So it was like not leather gloves, but leather straps. That the quote on here that we looked up was like that disfigured people's faces. So,
Oh, I bet, man.
Yeah,
You'd be taking
dude.
some damage.
Yeah, dude, for sure. Then there's the pankration. Okay, this is one of the most famous ones as well, and this is a blend of boxing and wrestling. This is basically the UFC. They had a UFC, and this was what it is. Pankration. It's basically like you wrestle or you box. You just fight until somebody's like defeated. And this is like there's an ancient Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, right? He goes in the labyrinth, he has to find a way, and then he sees a Minotaur, then he has to kill that Minotaur. So the Pankration, that event, is based off of this story, based off of this ancient guy. And Theseus also was considered to be a demigod. There you go, because he fought a Minotaur, which is like a bull and a
Bull
horse,
man.
and bull man, horse, lookout, whatever. So each event, as you guys know now, it was like a war training, right? And there's the marathon that we have now, but the marathon event wasn't added until 1896 in Athens. They didn't have like a version of a marathon. But like to close off like the events that they had, they were like equestrian events. This is the last event, like horse races or chariot races, and they race in a thing called the hippodrome, which looks a lot like our football stadiums and track and field stadiums today. This is where you had a story about this too, right? About the Roman guy.
Oh,
in the chariot.
yeah. So the legend has it that this like Roman emperor, I forget his name. So apparently he entered this chariot race, and it was an 8-horse race. And he actually showed up with 10 horses, and he ended up falling off his chariot during this race, right? So he fell off his chariot, and they still declared him the winner, obviously, because he was a Roman emperor. So
fair
he
enough.
cheated and he fell off,
And
and he
s-
still won.
And especially like in Roman times, that was also like around the end of the Olympics. So
Yeah.
these guys like obviously didn't care
Exactly,
at all. They're like, no,
exactly.
he's the emperor, give it to him.
Exactly.
Well, over there, like emperors could lose. Like ancient Greece, emperors could lose and not be champion. Yeah, that might hurt their politics on the way back. For
Yeah,
sure.
well, that would be like war, I'm sure, like later, right?
Yeah. So in ancient times, it started with 1 day. Then in 684, it became 3 days, and then in the 5th century, it became 5 days in terms of the ancient. And at that time, they were up to 18 events. 18 events only. Okay. And the sports are like they weren't even sports. They were just like go run, basically, or ride a chariot. They didn't have like a sports necessarily concept. And now we have 16 days and about 300 events with 35 officially recognized sports. So it's huge now. And I'm sure the ancient Greeks weren't so welcoming of other people's sports and things like that. They're like, oh no, this is what we do, and it's an ancient tradition. You don't want to ruin it, until the Romans came and basically ruined it. So prior to games in ancient Greece, messengers called spondophoroi were sent across the Greek world to announce this Olympic truce, and that's known as the ekecheria. And basically every participating city-state had to sign, and if they didn't sign, then they would be disqualified from competing in the Olympics this year. And this wasn't necessarily a city-state thing. This was just the strongest people from each city-state would go, but there's no necessarily connection between the city-state and then the athlete, just that the athlete was from there. But it wasn't like it was glory to the city-state or anything necessarily, or unless they won a lot, then we're like, oh, all these heroes came from there. And the truce is about no war was permitted in Olympia. And at that time, there was a ceasefire in the warring tribes or whoever's warring. And no arms were allowed to be carried into Olympia as to avoid all this, right? This facilitated safe passage for all the athletes and the spectators. And then this truce initially started as 1 month, but eventually it was extended to a 3-month truce, even though, it was like a 5-day Olympia. Yeah. But you had like celebrations and whatnot after, so you want to make sure that people follow it. And it's also a great place now for merchants, artists, musicians, all these other people to come in and, sell their wares, show people their art, and like I said, poor people as well coming there to just, party. Who took part in the Olympics? Women, Greek citizens, they were entitled to participate, okay? And there's a distinction they have apparently between participating and competing, but they were not permitted to compete. And also several emperors competed. The loophole for women was that chariot races and horse races, the horse owners were declared the champion, not the rider. Even with the chariot, it was the chariot owner and the guy who owned the horses, or the woman who owned the horses, not the guy who was riding.
I mean, it makes sense because it's the horse that wins the race.
Yeah, but that's how anyone was allowed to own a horse, right? And that's how Kiniska, which was the daughter of Archidamos of Sparta, she became the first female Olympic victor because she owned the horses. It's a pretty cool story.
That is cool.
Yeah. And for the rest of the women who couldn't afford horses, okay, there was a separate festival called the Heraian Games, which were dedicated to Hera, which is the wife of Zeus. And this was created only for women, also in Olympia. And basically it was a foot race. It was basically just a foot race, okay? And it was a foot race that was 1/6 the size of the men's like track, basically.
Yeah, so like 40-yard dash.
Yeah. Basically it was their whole event.
Yeah. Well, that's cool though.
Another thing that was really interesting to me because, and I'm going to quote this from this one, but the ancient Greeks, they didn't just rely on goodwill to ensure fair competition. Okay, because people are going to try to cheat, do whatever it is, oil themselves up so that they're slippery or something like that. So there was all protocol and everything that you had to abide by. And athletes who broke the rules were publicly whipped. Whether it was a foul move in wrestling or a false start in running, officials called elites had the power to punish any competitor they felt was trying to gain an unfair advantage. In addition to the floggings, athletes could also be slapped with hefty financial fines, a physical reminder of what awaited rule breakers in the row of statues with like Zeus lining the athletes' path to Olympia Stadium, where they were paid their fines. So
could you imagine if that was still like a same practice today, like outside of the fines, like
it's like a walk of shame.
I mean, like the whipping and stuff. Like, could you imagine if the athletes who got caught doping was like, okay, well, you're gonna sit in the middle of the stadium and we're gonna whip you.
So there's
well, you did. It's your fault. You chose to do this.
Yeah.
We have like
Right on
modern
the
day.
ass.
Yeah.
We have modern day Olympic stories and modern day World Cup stories, because World Cup is international too, where like Iraq was an example, Afghanistan was an example, where like their players underperformed and they lost. And when they went back to their country, they were tortured. Like Iraq was a huge story. It was either FIFA Cup or the Olympics where they were embarrassed and those guys were tortured. So serious guys. Libya was another example too. Like Libya, they just killed those guys in the soccer games if they didn't do well.
Really?
Yeah, so they're literally playing for their lives, dude. It could get
Wow.
real intense. Yeah.
It really doesn't make any sense to me.
No,
yeah,
it's
let's
not
just
fair.
kill the best players in our country. That's really going to breed
but
better
it's
players.
like, oh, you made us look bad on a global stage. We're insecure as a country. We're gonna kill you because you shamed us.
Yeah, well, that's where all the politics starts to creep into the Olympics. There's a huge, deep-rooted history in the Olympics of political motivations, right? You have some state-sponsored doping. There's also obviously some cheating. And you have these types of things. You don't win, you die, or you get punished, or whatever the case
There's
may
even
be.
states and countries that say we won't compete against another country based off their beliefs or what they've done to us. An example is like
Yeah.
Israel, Palestine. Like there's Palestinian people who will not wrestle or go against Israeli athletes because obviously, Israel, Palestine was a big
Yeah.
conflict,
Yeah.
still is.
Yeah. So another interesting fact about ancient Greece that I found out is that they competed in the nude. So they either competed in the nude or they had like a small white cloth that they covered their like intimate parts with. But basically athletes did that, and nudity in ancient Greece, they're kind of like synonymous with each other. They're very comfortable with it and whatnot. But athletes did it to show off their physique, how built they were, like all the different muscles they have and whatnot. So they just competed in the nude. Another interesting thing that I found is the word gymnasium comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. So there you go, gym goers. Everybody get naked. Just kidding. I think we're all really glad that the Olympics are not competed in naked nowadays.
Would be interesting though.
It would be
It would
interesting.
be a very interesting sight.
One of the most interesting things we found was the differences in the prizes and rewards as compared to today and in ancient Greece. Ancient Greece was a completely different story. It almost mattered more to become a champion than it does today. Today, you get a few medals and you get a couple sponsorships and you basically like do a bunch of interviews. That's really it. You're not necessarily immortalized. So back in the day, there was no gold, silver, bronze medals. The prizes were only awarded to one winner or the winners of like specific events. And the first was a wreath made of the leaves of the sacred olive trees at Olympia. Another was winners could put up a statue in Atlas Grove. This is at the sanctuary of the gods at Olympia. However, only the wealthiest could afford that, and in some cases, some champions were backed by like wealthier families in their city-state, and that's why they got to put up a statue. But then they do become immortalized, and their statues are put up in the same garden as the statue of their gods. And they lived through like many odes and stories and poems. They lived on. They lived on for a long time, as long as there was an ancient Greek empire. Then also there was odes, specific odes dedicated to the finishers by famous poets, which were then performed when the athlete returned home, and then were performed on and on and on and on. And the winners and their families were also invited to a giant feast like you can't even imagine. Like these almost seem like more meaningful things, And I think this
Yeah.
happens on a scale you don't really talk about where Michael Phelps was hanging out, even though he was hanging out with Snoop Dogg or whatever. But you don't really, I don't know. There's just, maybe I don't watch the Olympics, but the Greek ones sound a little bit more meaningful to me. Now, the Olympics were so popular in ancient Greece that they were allowed to continue after the Roman conquest. And in fact, Roman emperors also got to compete with them, in them. And as time went on, even in the Roman Empire, they kind of lost their size and they lost their prestige. And eventually it was like 1,500 years later until it came about again. But Olympia crumbled as more and more invasions took place, earthquakes, floods. The ancient Olympics finally ended in about 394 AD as the Roman Emperor Theodosius I outlawed all pagan celebrations. So meaning it wasn't necessarily about the sport for them, it was about the religious rituals. And once they were outlawed, they're like, why are we going to go to Olympia?
like,
We can't
what's
do
it
our
about?
religion and stuff.
Yeah.
And then the first modern day Olympics, it took place 1,503 years later in Athens in 1896. And the father of the modern day Olympics. This is in around 1894. He brought this up to global community or whatever. Was Baron Pierre de Coubertin. He was responsible for the rebirth of the Olympics.
It's really interesting to think that, and you had these Roman emperors who would go and compete, right? And that's probably where the Olympics really started to have its downfall, right? In that ancient times. It's because they kind of were like competing like a joke almost. They already conquered Greece, and I'm sure they would just like make sure that they won. They took the sport out of it in that sense, and I guess that's a big like motivation as to why people weren't as into it anymore, and it kind of just like went away for over 1,000 years.
Yeah, a lot of these things, like so many things get lost in translation. You look at something like the Olympic torch. In like the movies and the shows, they always showed it like at ancient Greece or at Olympia, they had like a torch ceremony. That's not the case. They had torch ceremonies for other festivals and stuff like that. But you know how now, like when the torch lights the cauldron or whatever, symbolizes the beginning of the Olympics. Mm-hmm. That only came about, let's say, in like 1928 Olympics in Amsterdam, and before that, maybe one time before, until we had the 1936. No, so 1928. Yeah, and then the 1936 one, there was a different one. That was the Berlin Olympics was like the modern day torch. And the reason why I bring that up, when we get into our Germany conversation, that they had a huge elaborate thing with their torch because they really cared about symbolism and myths and things like this.
Yeah.
So that kind of brings us to the end of ancient Greece. But what we can see is that these events are significant in meaning and in value to the people who choose to take part in it. So let's kind of now discuss, what does it mean to each region to compete in an event such as this? Like, what kind of things come about? Like, patriotism comes about, nationalism comes about, and here's the place where nobody is offended by nationalism, right? But this is a very nationalistic thing. What do you guys think?
You bring up the point of nationalism in terms of the Olympics. You look at all these different countries and see that they're obviously competing for gold, and there's even this thing where it's a competition of how many medals can you bring home, which is a big thing, but also how many gold medals you can bring home, because China and America are obviously in a huge race for it. So when I think that we're sending off these great athletes to represent our country, I think it's a big honor thing. It's almost like we're sending someone from our family to represent us, to show that how powerful and great we are, and to be able to bring home the gold medal in whatever sport it is something that obviously grants respect to the individual that got the gold medal, but also builds more respect for the country, because it obviously means that they're breeding better athletes because of how they treat their society in a way.
So, I mean, but okay, you're sending the strongest and the fastest, not necessarily the most politically astute, not the most educated person. Based off what you said, how does sending like the strongest and fastest people show how good of a country you are?
And it's not only just how your athletes perform that shows how good of a country you are. It's also a big nationalistic / honor thing to host the Olympics, right? These countries spend billions of dollars to host an Olympics, and in the process to it, they usually build new stadiums, new housing facilities, clean up the city. You want to showcase how great your nation is by having a beautiful stadium or whatnot. I know like the Beijing Olympics was like famous because in China, they made it very nice. Well, everyone was shocked as to how nice all the conditions were there, right? And leading up to it, as we know, like China has a lot of environmental issues, smog and things like this, but like leading up to that, they apparently ionized the clouds, so monsoons of rain came, cleaned up all the air, and then like the Olympics happened and it was perfect outside.
Yeah, and at the same point of what you're making is how they make all these state-of-the-art stadiums and these beautiful sceneries for when all these different countries come and perform in their designated sport. There was a huge controversy with, I think it was the last Olympics, the Rio Olympics, because their country's supposedly like broke and they don't have any money. That people are starving on the streets. There's no food in the markets, and they agreed to host the Olympics thinking that would generate revenue for them. But in reality, the Olympics is a loss. It doesn't generate revenue for a country. It's a huge loss. You spend billions of dollars on infrastructure for all these different stadiums and stuff like that. Then these people come for a week, spend some money, but it's not like millions, hundreds of millions of people are coming and spending money to generate you the revenue you need to make up for all of this spending. And then afterwards, with the Rio Olympics, all of these stadiums and all these different places that they built went unused. Now they're just
empty ghost towns.
Yeah, they look like ghost towns, and they're empty. They're disgusting.
Yeah.
They're places that nobody's going to go to ever again.
You know, that's a good point you bring up. That's actually one of my biggest problems with the Olympics, and I have specific examples a little bit later about how when the Olympics comes to a country and comes to a city, whoever lives in that city better get ready to get the fuck out. Like, they'll literally, the Russian example is in the Sochi Olympics. Sochi was a city. Like, the people lived there. There's apartments and stuff. They just displaced those people, destroyed those apartments, and they didn't, set them up somewhere else. They just said go. And they built this giant stadium out of nothing, which cost them $46 billion. But I'll get into it later. I have like a whole pitch.
Yeah, it's just a big flex, and as you said, typically they don't make money. I know this like Tokyo one, I don't know if you guys like noticed, but everything said like 2020 Olympics. Why? It's because they spent so much money putting out all this 2020 stuff. They weren't going to get rid of it and put 2021 on there, and they operated at a huge loss because they didn't have any like tourism because of COVID, right? So it was empty stadiums. This was the biggest Olympics at a deficit ever.
Clearly when you're sending like these strong men and women to compete, and you guys are saying it's about honor, and there's like all this patriotism and whatnot. So clearly these events are political, right? Yes. But we could make an argument that the political side of it, firstly, we don't have stories from the ancient Greek times, but since the beginning of the modern day Olympics, how political they are might be seen. I think the earliest example that we have is the Berlin Olympics, right? 1936, a huge, a lot of controversy during that time. So TV, this is very interesting to me about that Olympic specific. TV, TV became politicized now. It's like how you spread politics now anyway, right? But TV wasn't necessarily mainstream all over the world at this time, but it was televised. And the two companies, the Berlin Olympics, the two companies that televised it were two German companies. And we know that mass media, TV, movies, radio was a huge part of the Nazis' operations in terms of spreading their propaganda. Yeah. And it's funny to me that the two companies, because we know that Hitler really wanted to show off his Aryans or whatever, his superior race. He really wanted to show them off. And I think they won. They
actually did.
They won the most medals.
They had the most medals, and U.S. Actually came up like second. But it's very interesting about that Olympics. So at the time, right? So we have like Hitler, who comes into power, I think in 1933 or something like this. He comes into power. They enact obviously all these racist policies. If you weren't an Aryan living in like Germany, that was a horrible time then. Right. And a lot of like Western countries, as soon as Hitler was elected, they did take notice. And I was kind of shocked as to how fast word spread back then. Even, this was like in the 30s, and the media was still telling the story as to what's going on there. Like a lot of people were offended by it, and they wanted to boycott the Olympics, right? And obviously, Hitler did not want any of these countries to boycott because he wanted to show off his
except he didn't want
country.
Jews or blacks at
he didn't.
He specifically
but
said,
so the U.S. was going to boycott this Olympics. There was a huge push from the U.S. that wanted us to boycott. And at the time, the head of the International Olympic Committee was an American. His name was Avery Brundage. This guy, he wanted the U.S. to compete. He was also known as a Nazi sympathizer. He wanted the U.S. to compete, did a whole bunch of like lobbying to make it happen, and ended up successfully getting the U.S. to compete in this, right? And also what's interesting about this Olympics, so Hitler obviously didn't want any Jews or blacks, but the Olympic Committee forced Germany to have at least one Jew on the team, right? And
Wow.
they ended up did. And it was a woman. She was actually going to compete in high jump for Great Britain. So they pulled her from like Great Britain to go back to Germany. So
Wow.
so she could compete. But also, not only that, this was the first Olympics where the U.S. actually allowed blacks to, compete. The one Olympics prior, obviously many blacks qualified, but they just were not allowed to compete, in the Olympics. And actually, the NAA, CP at the time, wanted all the black athletes to not go. And they were like, why are you guys going to go and compete for this country who doesn't like you and make it seem like we're accepted here or whatever? But they ended up going because they felt that it was more powerful to show that put these black athletes out on the world stage, televised, obviously, and like they wanted to win.
And they did win.
And they did win, and that's also why the U.S. even allowed them to compete, because they wanted to beat Germany, and their
Yep.
best way to beat Germany was to have these blacks.
And there was a movie about this, right?
Jesse Owens movie.
Jesse
Yes.
Owens, yeah, it's about
There
Jesse
was a
Owens,
movie. There was a movie.
I believe it was called Race. Or
Yeah,
something like
but
that.
it's funny because there was actually 18 blacks who competed in this Olympics. Jesse Owens is the only guy. He did win like 4 golds, but
Did any of the other people win anything?
yes, half of the golds or half of the medals accounted for were from black athletes, and there was only 18 of them. And that's why when the U.S. came in like second, how the Nazis spun it, or how like the Germans like spun it, was the biggest disappointment was the U.S. because if it wasn't for the black athletes, they wouldn't have done that well.
They didn't want them to come to begin with because they know that they're gonna get wrecked.
Yeah,
So-
well, actually, so like Hitler, he was there to receive all the athletes and stuff, and when they won gold, he was gonna receive them. But when like the Germans won gold, he was there to like give them their medals and whatnot. But when the first black athlete was Jesse Owens who won, he obviously left. He and then they gave him an ultimatum. They said, all right, either you're gonna receive everybody or you're gonna hide out. And he actually did not watch any more of the games. He stayed down below, watched from there.
What's also always interesting to me when it comes to Nazis is like their love and affinity towards like the mythological things, like Norse mythology, whatnot. So the torch, and they're really about symbols and putting on a show and all this, things are supposed to be seen a certain way. So the torch, theirs was a very specific torch, like so they actually used the sun's rays to light the fire at the original Olympia in Greece, okay? So you used the sun to light it, whatever reason, and then it traveled. There was 3,300 torchbearers until it got to Berlin. Yeah. And then they gave it, then it started and whatnot.
Yeah, it was amazing.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, dude, they
but-
really cared.
And I also don't want to leave this out. I spent quite a bit of time diving into this Olympics, but I want to say that Olympic experience for all these like countries and whatnot, they thought that like Berlin was great. Obviously, like there was tons of Nazi flags and stuff everywhere, but the people were very nice to them. They treated all the blacks as equals there, so they almost didn't want to come back.
You bring up a good point. Remember I was telling you about Germany. In Germany, like the black people there, they were never treated as, like a subspecies, let's say. So Germany, like they have very successful black people there.
Yeah, well, at the
Because they're, like, a
time
part of the
though,
society.
at the time,
Who's
so
out
what
for
was
us,
going in, with Hitler and stuff, anybody who wasn't Aryan was treated very badly, right? But part of the part of the deal that Germany had
The
to
truce,
make
the oath.
in order for all these countries not to boycott was they had to treat everybody equally, even the Jewish athletes, right? And so they kept their word on that. They did not keep their word with their own Jewish athlete, that one like woman. They ended up telling her, yeah, sorry, I know you like came over here, but you're not going to compete and we're not going to reimburse you for your travel. And that was it. So yeah, that was the one thing where they went back on their word. But other than that, they kept their word. They treated everybody well. Everybody was happy.
Another angle that I think is very interesting is the fact that we had these black athletes obviously represent our country in one way or another, whether it be political or not. Um, this is in the 1930s, correct? And the civil rights movement didn't happen until 1954, and so on and so forth. So we at our home are still mistreating blacks, still not giving them the civil liberties and the rights that they deserve, and are not being treated as equals. But then we want them to go represent our country
because we
at
wanted
the
to
time.
win.
Yeah, because we want to win. But then it's like, oh yeah, you win, but fuck the rest of you guys. Like, to not mince words. It's like,
you come
it doesn't
back-
really make sense how we are fighting a figure that is oppressing a whole entire civilization or culture, religion, what have you. But then we're doing it on our own front because we want to beat these people by and using people that we are segregating and harming and not giving them the civil liberties that they deserve at the time. We are taking those people and using them to represent our country. I think it's very hypocritical and in a way doesn't make any kind of sense in a political platform. Whether or not we want to win or not, it doesn't show the message that we really want it to show at the end of the day.
Yeah, like the famous story is Jesse Owens won four gold medals at the Olympics, but he came back and still had to sip from a different fountain or sit in a different seat or not walk in the same room. That's a tragedy.
Yeah. And like as I was going through this, a lot of like they had to go through a lot, right? Even on the boat ride there was some black athletes who were in the first class with all the white athletes, but a lot of these people back then, it was like if you were white, you didn't even really want to touch any of these people. You didn't want to breathe the same air. It was kind of like the big weird thing, but in the end, they ended up like making a lot of friends, right? Whether it be in the Olympic Village or that, I think it was like a 5-day, boat ride, to get to Berlin. They ended up like, becoming, friends with some of these people, but still it just like, highlighted the fact of this hypocrisy that America was living in at the time.
Yeah, and I think another, in terms of the nationality question, tying it back to your question about nationality, I think it's really fascinating that all of these different people come from all the different places in the world, right? And then they compete, and they show who's superior versus who's not superior. But as we know, America is a boiling pot of different races and different cultures and stuff like that. So we can't say, oh, just because America is great, that doesn't mean necessarily that, oh, these people actually come from America. They can come from, anywhere in the world. But since they were born and raised in America, they're technically American. But the point that I'm trying to get across is that we have all these different competing athletes from different parts of the world, and different people from different countries are winning gold all the time. So there isn't necessarily one superior race or one superior culture. It literally shows that there is not any perfect way of going about life or one perfect civilization in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, but I could say that the reason why all these countries now compete, they send their best of the creme de la creme, they send them. And I think it comes back to like our baser needs. And if you look at what we're trying to do is what we're trying to find out is who's the best. If it's political and we're sending all these people, there is one best race, is whoever gets the gold medals, right? Yeah. That's the logic behind this, right?
Yeah. Yes, but if you have it, let's say you have theoretically, you have a African American or French person come to America, and then they, are raised in America, and then they go and represent America. They aren't necessarily like the people who are from America that are supposed to be representing theoretically America, like compared to, like, let's say a Chinese person that was born and raised, has all their ancestors in China and so on and so forth, that go and represent China as what Chinese people are supposed to be.
And that actually happens a lot too. A lot of like athletes will go to a different like country who they might have some type of relation or like connection to, even though they're not from there. So say there could be a like Jamaican like sprinter, right? As we know, like Jamaica is usually like they always win gold, right? In in these races, but they might have, maybe their mom's sister, so their aunt is from like Great Britain. So then they'll go to Great Britain to qualify for the Olympics and represent, Great Britain.
Or like
to get
Pau
there.
Gasol playing for the Italian team. Versus
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. He plays for Spain. A lot of these NBA athletes will go back to their home country, right? But I kind of want to go through. So yes, they say that the Olympics is mostly about the athletics, right? But there's been all throughout the history of the Olympics, there's been these chances for people to take like political stands, right? Whether it be the athletes or even like some head of states. I mean, we could go down the line here in 1948 in London. Obviously, this is right after like World War II. Britain, they banned both like Germany and Japan from the Olympic Games. They didn't want them there because obviously we just got done with a huge war with these guys. All right, so that's one little like political jab there. Also, the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne, there were actually two like political protests that were held. Egypt, Iraq, and Lebanon all skipped those games. They wanted to like protest the Israeli invasion of the Sinai Peninsula at the time. At that same one, it was Spain, Switzerland, and the Netherlands also skipped to protest the USSR at the time, their invasion of Budapest, right? But that was also interesting because Budapest is obviously in Hungary, right? But Hungary and Russia competed against each other in water polo that year. Very intense, right? This is where we had like a very like similar deal with China and with Russia during like the Cold War. During these times of heated points in these two like countries, they get to almost have their battle right on the Olympic floor or whatever. A very
Well said.
highly contested event. But also very like famous for us here. In 1968 in Mexico City, we had there was a big like protest. So like what we alluded to earlier, these Mexican college students were protesting because the government paid all this money for the Olympics, but they didn't pay any type of money for like social programs. And check this out, when they were protesting, the military surrounded them and opened fire, killed 200 of them, over 1,000 were injured. That was like right when the Olympics started there in Mexico City. And then later on in that one, we obviously have the famous San Jose State sprinters during the heat of the civil rights movement. We had the two sprinters, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, who like famously raised their fists for the Black Power right on the stand there in Mexico City. They were also joined with a Australian guy who got the silver medal, and all three of them wore a human rights badge because there was plenty of like human rights issues.
Sorry to cut you off. Like on that moment with Carlos and Smith, they were actually banned from the Olympics afterwards.
Yes.
And Norman was shunned from competitions afterwards. So even though they did this great and like historically one of the most profound protests of all time in terms of the Olympics, they were banned and shunned for the rest of their life from competing ever again.
And I want to thank you for actually reminding me because I did have a piece on that. So obviously they did that, but this guy Avery Brundage, he was still the head of the IOC at the time, and he was outraged by this. Right, he was outraged that they did that. They deemed it a domestic political statement, and it was a gross violation of Olympic morals or whatnot. But check this out. So he tried to suspend them from the Olympic Village and ban them from the games or whatever. The U.S. Olympic Committee actually said no, they were against it. Then he threatened to ban the whole Olympic track team. And then they were like, all right, fine, you can get rid of them. But so the weird thing is this guy had no problem in the Berlin Olympics with the Nazi salute. Every time they won or whatever, they were doing the Nazi salute. He was cool with it. But
he was a sympathizer, right?
Yeah, he was known. So that's why after that Olympics, they actually removed him You know,
Get that guy out of there.
yeah. They had to remove him.
To play devil's advocate in just this specific scenario, I mean, like when Americans hear the national anthem, they hold their hand to their chest, you know, toward the heart and everything like that, which is in a way the Nazis, like Nazis have their Nazi salute. Would America's form of salute be holding their hand to their chest?
You are
even
exactly
still, dude,
right, though.
Even still, but this is like relative to what we've agreed upon and seen, because if the Nazi sign was the hand on your chest, it would be like, oh, don't put your hand on your chest.
Yeah, well, you know, actually, he's right, because that's how that was his excuse, right? They were saying at the time it was a domestic policy type thing, right? It was just what
because
they
when
did.
their anthem was going on, that's what they would do. They would hold their hand up.
They
right?
would, yeah, exactly, do that, or you know, so here in America, right, we like put our hands on our chest, or they would do a salute, something like that, right?
Yeah,
and
like
you
a
know, you even
military
can see
salute.
like, you know, I believe it's like pictures of Jesse Owens and some other athletes when they won, they were doing a salute at the time. But to continue on of the more like political things, in 1972, this is what I wanted to bring up a little bit earlier, but we had the Munich massacre. So obviously this is in, you know, Germany, and this one I was kind of surprised when I heard it. So these Palestinians actually had infiltrated the like Olympic Village, and they killed 2 Israeli athletes, took 9 others hostage, and they were trying to negotiate the release of 200 Palestinian prisoners. But I guess like the German police were not ready. There was 8 like Palestinians also who were taking part of this, but so like the German police were not adequately prepared for this. So these guys ended up negotiating their way to a nearby airport. Police tried to ambush them, failed, ended up killing all of the hostages, all of the Israeli.
Oh man.
Yeah, and then the police ended up killing like 5 of the 8.
On that note, what you're talking about, from the research that I did, I remember seeing a part in it that because of Germany obviously losing the war and through, I don't know the exact organization, like the rules and law of the land was that the military police and the military can't invade or be involved with the local police or the state police force. So the state police force had these people like you're talking about when they tried to swarm the plane and kill all these Israelis. They weren't military trained. They weren't specialized in their field. They didn't have the equipment that they needed. They used like assault rifles instead of sniper rifles. They were in the wrong positions at the time, and certain things like that. You know, I know this is different from the Olympics, but like it's kind of important because when you think about it, like that, the military couldn't be involved in this. The people who specialize in, you know, counterterrorism couldn't actually go there and fight the terrorist attacks that were going on.
Yeah, and you know, you have to think there probably wasn't that many like terrorist attacks, so they weren't even probably prepared for terrorist attacks. And this was less than 30 years since like World War II had ended. Germany obviously had to go through some major reconstruction, and this country was just not ready, right? They were not ready to handle this type of thing, and that was obviously a big political statement, right? So as we can see, there's huge history of not just usually the athletes always, but it's people to use this Olympics, which is a world staged event, to get their ideas and their points across.
Yeah, and when you look at the 1980s political event with Jimmy Carter, Carter even threatened to rescind the passports of any of the Americans who try to compete under just a neutral Olympic banner. Like you're seeing today, how Russia is technically banned from the Olympic Games, but there's still Olympic athletes who are competing that are Russian, that are competing, and then they're trying to feng shui the Russian heritage into it, even though they're not supposed to. But even to think like there's these athletes that want to compete but don't want to be politicized, can't even go and compete and try and win a gold medal, take politics out of it without being banned from the Olympics or being banned from coming back to your own country, which I think is a little ridiculous and a little bit over the top. And it wasn't even just America. Canada, West Germany, and Japan joined the United States in the stance.
Yeah, and actually, I'm not sure if we stated, but the U.S. did boycott those 1980 Olympics, right? That was by the direction of the president at the time, it was Jimmy Carter. We boycotted that Olympics because of Russia's invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah. One other thing, I mean, leading up to all these political stances, people building up this political tension in the Olympics, the end all be all, the whole reason for the Olympics was to be neutral, right? So the IOC came out with a rule, specifically Rule 50, saying you cannot make any political scenes or make any political gestures that represent either your country or your ideologies or stuff like that, anything that's fighting one way or the other. And in specific, like the goal explained by the commissioner of the IOC, explained it was to suppress protests and keep the games as neutral as possible and apolitical as possible. The Olympic Charter infamously states that no kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in any Olympic sites or venues. And right when it was passed, there was a huge controversy with it because everyone's an individual, everyone has their own rights and liberties, and so on and so forth. They actually did a study. They took a survey of about 3,500 Olympians regarding protests in the games, and they found that 67% of the athletes responded said that they thought the medal podium was not appropriate for demonstrations. They thought that that's a place that should be individualized, that like should be taken out of politics, because everyone wants to have their own limelight, right? Everyone wants to be themselves and like show that they are who they are. And let's say there's a bronze athlete or a silver athlete or even a gold athlete, whatever, they do some political stance. That means that they're taking away from the special event that the other two people on the podium have achieved. And I'm not saying one way or the other is right, but I understand the side of like, hey, this is my special event. Like, you're going to take all the attention away. Like, we all just did something great today. There was a problem with the study, was that supposedly 14% of the responders were from China, but that was a misproportionate amount of people who in the Olympics, when it was I think only 4% of the participants in the 2016 Olympics were Chinese.
To kind of go off of that, Corey, my thing is there's some people or some of these athletes who compete in the Olympics, but where they're from, they don't have a chance to protest. Say you are like from China and you don't like how things are going or whatever the government's doing, or you're from like Belarus, right? We have like the one athlete from Belarus who had her deal this past Olympics. You can't protest there. You protest there, they like hurt you or whatever. But this is your chance to tell the world, or at least let the world know, or tell or show them what's happening where you're from.
Yeah, one specific quote that I think ties perfectly to exactly what you're saying. Like, there's people who like they can never ever get their face or get their point across to the world, or get like a group that's being suppressed across. And there's this person, Nikki Dryden, who is a two-time Olympian swimming from Canada, stated, once you get to the Olympics, you might have one fleeting moment in the light without anyone editing you, which obviously is a big deal, right? Yeah. And Olympians who choose to use that moment to shine attention on something of deep meaning to them, they shouldn't be punished, right? Yeah. And in fact, they should be supported and celebrated, because they're using the one special moment, the thing that they worked their entire lives for, that they fought for, they suffered, they went through all these grueling processes and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. They finally get to the moment where it's like, hey, this is about me. This shouldn't be about anybody else. They're using that to represent a whole group that's either being suppressed or segregated or this or that.
And you said that perfectly, because they're saying it for a whole group. It's always bigger than themselves, right? Yes. Them standing on the medal stage or like the podium, that's supposed to be for them, right? But yes, when they choose to use that moment to help others, I think, like you said, it should be like celebrated, because that's one, it's brave, and two, they're trying to help as many people as they possibly can in the only way that they could.
So that's all well and good, what you guys have said, and obviously we have a clear answer of whether or not the Olympics are political. It's evidently clear, it's right in front of your face, that answer. And it's all well and good that these guys get that platform and then get to talk about that group, but it's actually just their group. It's the group that they either identify with, or it's the group that they want to promote. The biggest tragedy in the Olympics, and I want whoever's listening to never forget this, is the people that were left behind in building the damn stadium. And the example that I have is Sochi Olympics, because they don't have a voice. They got their homes taken away just like everybody else always does. Not a single person gets on there and says anything for them. You look at the Sochi Olympics, it cost them $42 billion to set up. They also broke records of revenue generation, and all that money just went to Putin and his best friends, okay? Sochi it wasn't a bustling city, it wasn't a popping off city, but there were a significant amount of people living. It's Russia, there's a lot of people. Sochi was like a shitty little town where a lot of people lived. They were already living in squalor, but they had apartments and whatnot. They first displaced every single person, like old people, moms, sick people. They literally displaced them into shittier, like, gutters. They destroyed, obliterated those buildings, and then built a $42 billion stadium, and nobody said a thing about that. The same example we have in Brazil, like Corey was talking about. This is just a thing that happens, and it also happens not just the Olympics, the World Cup. Wherever the World Cup goes, you got to build a new stadium.
I was about to bring that up, like in Qatar.
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly that. Qatar is a different situation because basically it's like a few hundred Qataris, and then everybody else just lives there to serve them, so they'll move around. You know what I mean?
Everything you said is true, Ollie. But what if one of those, say, like Russian athletes who won gold in Sochi chose to take the time to speak for those people who were displaced?
But they didn't.
They didn't. Exactly. You want to know why? It's probably because their government, if they were to go back home after that, they would have been punished, or their family would have been punished. So they can't, they weren't brave enough to say anything. Or they just didn't care because they didn't know anybody in Sochi. They weren't from Sochi.
And I say all this, like Sochi, Rio de Janeiro, wherever it is, right? Just remember that the cost of these large global events, the cost of the Olympics, is always more than it seems. So to answer the question, is the Olympics political? You're goddamn right it is. You just got to make sure that your country and your people have enough money to say something about it. And this year we had the Tokyo Olympics. A lot of controversy right off the bat behind these Olympics. Not more than usual, but it's still a lot as compared to, we were only talking about COVID-19 or whatever, and now we have all these other things to talk about. But a lot of mental health issues, drugs, protests, a lot of athletes being, reprimanded for not being aware of certain things. But what we talked about, and we touched on a little bit earlier too, is the pressure that these athletes are under, where they just wanted to, run fast. Now they have to be aware about all these politics and whatnot. But what's important to recall, because we put a lot of pressure on these athletes, we treat them, as superior, and we, hold them to higher standards. You got to remember that they're also human. They're also normal people. They're also religious. They're human beings at the end of the day.
Yeah, most famously from this Olympics was Simone Biles. She was supposed to be the best gymnast in the world, expected to get all golds, and she obviously dropped out of a few events, citing her mental health. Right, this was our first big controversy in this year's Olympics. She had so much pressure. Everybody expected her to win gold in every single event she competed in.
Yeah, so I heard that she takes Adderall or something for anxiety or to perform, okay? And then she was not allowed to do it in Tokyo because of regulations in Tokyo as it is. You're not allowed to take Adderall or something, or amphetamines or something like that. And especially not for work or whatever. They got a weird society. But she wasn't allowed to take them, so the pressure just got too much for her. She cracked. You know what I mean? That's basically what it is.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
she couldn't take her anti-anxiety medicine or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know necessarily about that. I didn't hear that detail, but what I did hear was that she had the what they call is the twisties, where they literally can't tell up from down. They can't control their bodies. They don't know where they're spinning in the air. It's like imagine vertigo, but you're flying through the air. Yeah. And one thing that on your point of they have this
expectation.
We have this expectation that they're supposed to perform and they are supposed to compete for gold and blah blah blah. And if they drop out, then that shows a sign of weakness, and in at least in America and some of the major superpowers, like you're not supposed to show weakness. But when it comes to like gymnasts where they're flying through the air and they don't know where they are and they could land on their neck easily or land on like the wrong part of the leg, break their ACL and ruin their career forever, like we need to take that into account. But I just think it's interesting that there's people who say, I don't care about your mental illness, I don't care about your anxiety, I don't care about what's going on with you, I want you to perform because you are sacrificing us winning gold because you don't want to perform because, oh, you have a mental illness. And I think obviously we're still in an adjustment period in our culture and society today in America of still shaming mental illness or not thinking that it's as big of a deal as it truly is in today's society, especially with high performing athletes. Because when you think about it, it's like you guys have been performing on this high level for so long, you guys should be used to this. So why now are you giving up? But in reality, it's a big deal. Like to be performing at that high level of society and that high level of performance over a certain period of time, it's going to take a toll on your mental strength.
Health. Yeah, it's a big safety issue, but also what she was able to do to bring attention to the mental health aspect of things, I think was huge. Obviously, it probably was hard for her in the time, and she did take some heat here from like some people who were just flat out not understanding, but it did bring a lot of attention. That's like what we alluded to earlier, you know, these athletes, they can do one little thing on the world stage there, the next thing you know, it's front page news, and now it brings so much more awareness, you know, to their plight.
Yeah, I mean, that's like I think more so she was just trying to get out of there, you know, like than it being brought to the attention. But yeah, I think things should change, especially in this country in terms of mental health, the stigma with it, like psychology. You know, people are afraid to go to psychologists here and whatnot. They think it makes them less, or for men, it makes them less manly. But you look at places like Argentina and Spain, even now Mexico, like going to a therapist is like a very normal thing. Like it's not you're not a psycho or something. And it's like a 1930s mentality to have now. Even, you know, like it's okay to get help when you need it.
And on top of that, you know, my brother's a professional athlete, and one thing that he said to me, or that I was kind of shocked by, was that there's team psychologists. Like every team hires psychologists, psychiatrists that the players go to on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to talk to them about their performance, what's going on in their personal lives, and try and talk them through anything that's, you know, maybe hindering their performance to obviously optimize their performance in the future, but help them because what they're doing is very stressful. Like if you think in regards to the highest performing athletes, if they mess up once, their career could be over. Not because necessarily they get hurt, but because they fail or they
say an unpopular opinion,
or like they don't do well in say one game, and then they have that mental block now that it's hard for them to hurdle over,
exactly,
right, for the next game or whatever.
Exactly. And Simone Biles being able to bring awareness to that is obviously great. And one of the best places to bring awareness to mental issues is that because everyone's watching, everyone in the world is watching, and everyone can understand and in a way sympathize with her. And you know, a person before the Olympics was Naomi Osaka, who did the same thing with press releases. She's like, I can't do this press release right now or press conference because my mental health is being damaged and I can't take this anymore. And I feel like she was the first domino before Simone Biles came out and did the same thing, and it really brought a lot more power to the message that Naomi Osaka was trying to bring to light. Another thing that kind of came out outside of Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka was Raven Sanders, who is a U.S. shot put person who won the silver at the games. And while they're receiving their medals, she actually did one way or another a peaceful protest that was where she would intersect her arms into an X. And it's meant to, like she explained it as, the gesture represents the intersection of where all people who are oppressed meet. And in her own words, she said, "For me, just being who I always aspired to be able to be me and not apologize for it, and show the younger generation that no matter what they tell you, no matter how many boxes that they try to fit you in, you can be you. And that's a very powerful message, because they're saying, hey, just be you, don't worry about what other people think of you.
I find it interesting, the layers, not only on an individual basis, the levels within this thing which is called the Olympics. The top layer being, politicians and people in power who want to win so that they look good or whatever other reason. Then you have the coaches and the athletes who really just want to perform well and want to do a good job and want to win, minus all these political. Then you have the bottom rung, or the people that get displaced when these Olympics come in, which nobody gives a shit about, nobody hears from. To go back to whether this Olympics or whether any Olympics is political, right? We have decided to say yes, that is the case. But the extent of how political it is and how far you get, that's usually depending. And for which group are you advocating for? Does that fall onto the athlete? Is that too much pressure? These are all very good questions to ask.
I think it's also like a motivation thing, for an athlete. Yeah, I guess it's like pressure, but I know, say, those black athletes in the 1936 when they were like representing a people at the time, right? Not just Americans, but their people who were thought of as inferior, right? And that motivated them even more to want to win gold.
Well, there it is. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming together. I think today was a phenomenal conversation. I think we really learned a lot this time around, too. What we talked about this time was the ancient Greek Olympics, what they looked like and the influence that they had on modern-day Olympics. We looked at Olympics. Are they political, yes or no? And we did decide, I think it was a reasonable conclusion, that yes, indeed, they are political. We also then talked about what modern-day events in modern-day Olympics looked like, going back to Berlin, Amsterdam, and the beginning in Athens. Then we talked about the current events of this Tokyo Olympics that is surrounded around controversy. If you made it this far in the podcast, we genuinely want to take the time to thank you very much. I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation as much as we enjoyed it, and I hope that your drink is finished by now. As always, thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Ali Lake, and I'm sitting here with Corey Bearclaw and Jordan Brown.
Good night.
Peace.